wrong with something.
The Division 2 is a game that is very interesting to look at over the span of its lifetime. On release, it was met with a lot of praise for its expanded content, fleshed out endgame, and incredible world design. It probably had the best launch in the looter shooter genre to date, and for good reason. Yes, Destiny 2 might have wowed critics at first, but after diving deeper into that game, it was clear to see that it was lacking in content later on. The Division 2 easily felt the most complete and polished at launch out of all the major players in the genre. The game currently sits at an 84 on Metacritic, which is an extremely solid score. While the well-rounded content and really impressive visuals definitely played their part in impressing gamers, I believe the main reason why it was so successful at launch was due to how the game actually felt to play. Game feel is the intangible, tactile sensation experienced when interacting with video games. The term was popularized by the book Game Feel, a game designer's guide to virtual sensation, written by Steve Swink. The different areas of a game that can be manipulated to improve game feel are aesthetic, input, context, response, metaphor, and rules, but we'll only be going through the first four for the purposes of this video. Let's talk about some aesthetics, my dudes. First of all, I'd like to point out that the guns in the Division 2 all sound phenomenal. It's to the point where I'll sacrifice putting the suppressor on my gun, even though it would give it more accuracy. The guns also look really good, and even though you won't be looking at them in the heat of combat, it's definitely a nice refresher on the inventory screen, which can be pretty dry at times. So the guns all look and sound great, which is good news when your game is about shooting dudes with guns. But what about the dudes you're shooting at? Well, I'm happy to report that those dudes are quite fun to shoot at. Each faction has a distinct visual design, which helps to make each fight feel different. Hyenas are drug addicts, outcasts are the edgy kids, True Sons played too much Modern Warfare 2 as a kid, and Black Tusk are high-tech dudes who played too much Modern Warfare 2 as a kid. Black Tusk does get quite repetitive in the endgame though, due to them being literally everywhere on the map instead of the good balance of other factions. Also, we'll be going over a couple other problems with the endgame later on, and don't you worry, I have a lot to say about it. So we know that combat looks and sounds great, but the environments are truly something else. Just, oh my god, this game is gorgeous. It's insane what technology can do when you have those sweet, sweet francs to fund your art team. Running around the open world is fun on its own just due to how good everything looks, but it's especially fun when you get to fight in it. It's crazy how good the level design is for each arena in this game. It avoids the biggest immersion killer in most cover-based shooters these days, which is that you know exactly when you're about to fight a bunch of dudes because the room is littered perfectly with chest-high cover. All the arenas feel like real places, which makes traversing and fighting in the arenas that much more immersive. Replaying missions in the Division 2 is always interesting due to the level design, which is a huge positive in a game about replaying content over and over. There's people out there way smarter and more articulate than me who go over the Division 2's level design and world, so I won't stick on it for any longer, just know it's really fucking good. Now, let's talk about input. The first thing I'd like to mention is that there's a disparity of quality between consoles and PC for this specific category. My first playthrough of this game was on an Xbox One, and while it was definitely still an enjoyable experience, I found it frustrating when trying to aim at enemies that were rapidly moving from cover to cover at a medium to long range, as well as keeping track of enemies who were moving around in close range. This may seem like a nitpick, but the game received quite a bit of criticism when the raid was released due to these issues. The raid took 3 days to beat for players on consoles, while PC players were able to beat it within hours of release. This led to a lot of community backlash, and console players asked for some mechanical changes to the game in order to balance out the difficulty. Massive Entertainment, the developers of the game, didn't change anything on console versions. While an argument can be made for raids needing to be the hardest difficulty content the game has to offer, there's a problem when that content is clearly designed for one section of the player base. There's too much of a difference between multiple groups of PC players beating the raid in hours, while only the highest skilled console gamers could only beat the raid days after launch. This was the first big misstep that Massive made with post-launch content, and it was a sign of things to come. We'll get into that later. For now, I'd like to talk more about input. I bought the Division 2 on PC when it went on sale for less than $15. I did this because I enjoyed the content quite a bit on console, and the leveling experience was really enjoyable. For the remainder of the video, I'll be talking about the game feel of the Division 2 on PC, mostly because I've put more hours into this version, but also because I found it to be more entertaining as well as better designed for the platform. Overall, the game plays excellently on mouse and keyboard. Your character snaps to cover without an issue, you can lean around corners and adjust your aim without a hitch, and you have a surprising amount of movement options available to you at any given moment. Holding down control to vault over cover for a clear angle on the enemy will always feel great. Everything feels snappy currently in the game. I remember at launch that deploying skills was especially tedious and never really felt right, as well as vaulting over cover being quite slow and janky. It also took quite a while to turn around from one side of cover to another. This was fixed by changing the settings at the time, and I have no idea why the fast option wasn't the default. Anyways, after returning to the game, these aspects have improved immensely since launch. I always feel like my inputs work how I want them to, and the game feels extremely responsive. Control of your character is extremely important when positioning is so vital to success, and The Division 2 hits the nail on the head in this regard. Now let's talk about context. Context is basically telling the player why they are doing what they are doing, and why it should matter. Now, I don't have to tell you that The Division 2's story is shit. It's kind of a meme now when Ubisoft tries to do stories, and I find it really funny. All the characters in this game are so forgettable. The only characters I remembered are Kelso and Manny. Kelso because she's with you literally the entire time, and they say her name like every 5 seconds. And Manny because I thought it was cool that he was the same voice actor of Nomad from Ghost Recon Wildlands, Mr. Shitballs himself. Anyways, there's no story context from the missions. I actually don't remember any of the reasons why I was going through and shooting people, other than that Declaration of Independence mission. I mean, that mission is literally a national treasure. Most of the context you'll be getting from your missions is that you're there to get some fat loot to improve your character, which is fine enough, but it could be so much better. Alright, so stick with me here. But what if The Division had a standalone game focused on episodic tales from different agents being activated? Think the Telltale games, but with gameplay of The Division still intact. There wouldn't be an extensive loot system in this one, but as you progress through episodes you can pick up better guns from enemies and searching the environment. Each episode would follow a different agent going through different points in their activation. For example, the tutorial could be following an agent going through training before the green poison outbreak. One episode could be following a family man who was called in and he had to abandon his family in order to save his city. Another one could be a woman who had fallen down on her luck since her training and she had become an alcoholic. We could see some agents who are reluctant to join the cause with their own backgrounds. The setting honestly has so much potential and it's frustrating to not see it be realized. I know that Ubisoft has it in them to make some great stories, just look at the audio logs from both games. Let me give you an example. One audio log I found was in The Division 2, but the recording took place in the original Division. It was a conversation between two members of the Cleaners faction. They were talking about their leader, Joe Farrow, and one character talked about how the next person to be in a leadership position should be Vivian Conley, the actual leader of the Cleaners in The Division 2. Funny how things work out. The other character immediately told her to stop talking about Joe in a way that wasn't positive. She sounded extremely angry that someone would even question the fact that Joe wouldn't be their leader forever. It showed how members of the Cleaners faction were so obsessed with their leader that they couldn't even imagine following someone else. This adds so much weight to when we took out Joe in the original Division. I love this piece of world building, and it totally proves that Ubisoft is capable of actual good writing. I could do a whole video outlining my ideas for this experimental game that I was talking about, and I might go through it with it in the future, but for now let's move on. Now I'd like to go over the difference between input and response. It's important to find the distinction between the two. Input is the feeling of having control of your character, while response is seeing how the game responds to your inputs. For example, when shooting at an enemy with no armor, you'll see clouds of blood come off where your bullets hit. This leads to a great feeling of player feedback, and knowing you're doing damage without looking at health bars. Skills are also a great example of how the game properly responds to your inputs. The Seeker Mine is an awesome demonstration of this. When this mine gets near an enemy, it explodes with a powerful, and then you see the enemy move out of cover and recoil from the explosion. They then take a couple of seconds to collect themselves and then resume combat. Direct combat skills all of this element of satisfaction to them, whether it's enemies being distracted by a flying turret drone or the hives making them stop in their tracks and flail their arms trying to get them off. The last major thing is something I absolutely love about The Division 2, and it was a really good feature that they added in, which is shooting an enemy while they're preparing to throw a grenade or something of that sort. If you do enough damage to them in this time window, they drop the grenade at their feet and get blown up by their own item. This never fails to make me feel like a badass, and it's a great example of how fighting enemies is so responsive. Now let's talk about the bane of my entire existence, the robot dog enemies. Oh my god, these things suck. They have an incredibly high health pool, do tons of damage if they catch you in a bad spot, and have absolutely no response to your damage to them. Sure, you can shoot their legs and get them out of the action, but it doesn't ever feel satisfying. It just doesn't make sense. Why would shooting at their legs just completely shut them down? I don't get it. They also don't stagger when dealt enough damage, which leads to a feeling of shooting at a four-legged brick wall. Whenever I see one of these guys, I already know that this combat encounter will be held back by Sparky, and I wish the developers came up with some other enemy types instead of him. Overall, the responsiveness of the combat is really good. Humanoid enemies all feel great to fight, with each faction reacting to damage in their own way that makes sense. For those of you who played the original or kept up with its news, you'll remember the backlash on the bullet sponge enemies. People really didn't like the fact that it took almost a full mag just to put down one enemy. I'm paraphrasing here, but SkillUp put it perfectly. People can look at enemies in Destiny 2 and expect that they'll take lots of firepower to take down, but in the Division, the enemies just look like normal people. You wouldn't expect gang number 72 to be able to take 23 bullets from a fully automatic rifle before being put down. You had to change your mindset in order to properly enjoy the game, which was something a lot of people weren't comfortable in doing or weren't prepared to do. This definitely changed in the Division 2, with enemies looking like literal walking tanks, doing recreational drugs right in front of you, or just getting to watch their body armor fly off. It feels much more grounded while essentially having the same function as a large health pool. It makes fights way more interesting when instead of being rushed by a few enemies with huge health bars, you're now fighting lots of enemies that each have different amounts of health. This leads to prioritization of targets and thinking about how you're going to go about combat encounters. It's important to get those elements when designing a cover shooter, and the Division 2 feels great in this regard, except the robot dogs. Fuck those guys. All in all, these factors combine to make the Division 2 feel really great to play. The combat is punchy and satisfying, the level design and world are incredible, and the enemies are distinct and react really well, etc. So this brings up the question, why the hell do people who play this game the most hate it so much? The new DLC, Warlords of New York, has a 0.4 user review score on Metacritic. 0.4. That's not great. Well, the answer for this question lies within the nature of the game. I wasn't lying before when I said that the combat, level design, and enemies are all incredible. What I didn't tell you was that this all gets thrown out the window once you're done with the campaign. After you do the leveling process, and if you own it, beat the Warlords of New York expansion, the game severely drops off in quality. Gear sets aren't all that exciting, all enemies gain a ton of health and damage, leading to most of them feeling like the robot dogs I talked about before, and the loot in general gets stale after a while. The systems seem like they are put in place to make you play for long amounts of time, instead of enjoy the time you do put into the game. So basically, all the problems with most loot games. I just find it so frustrating that this game has such a robust combat system all the way up until the end game, where it just goes back to being the worst parts of the original Division. They had the perfect game feel all the way up until you beat the campaign, and then it's gone. That's why I feel so strongly about wanting to have a standalone game that focuses on stories instead of randomized loot. The combat is just way too good to be forced into being dull and frustrating. There's too much talent and potential at Ubisoft and Massive for there to not be a fleshed out story anywhere in the games except for audio logs. I understand that the idea for grinding for gear is appealing to a lot of people, but put into practice it just doesn't work as well as it could in this setting. I suggest going with the same system for the Division 3, just with more decisions to enhance the combat experience, not make it take longer. And then on the side, a standalone game, with minor loot elements but a bigger focus on telling good stories. Develop actual characters that aren't so boring that I want to skip every single cutscene, and add some world building so that the main installments can have more context. The game might not have people playing for as long, but it will definitely leave a bigger impact on players. Thank you for watching. If you like my idea for a story-based Division game, please let me know in the comments. If you think it's dog shit, also please let me know in the comments. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and happy National Sewing Machine Day for those watching on the upload date or for years in the future.